Welcome to Total Network Operations, the podcast dedicated to hardworking network operators like you who deliver all the packets. You deliver the packets and we'll deliver the ops conversations. We are very excited to have a special episode today. We're here in Kentucky for the meeting of the Kentucky Network User Group tonight in Lexington. And I'm publishing and producing today with the Cloud Gambit podcast and the excellent hosts of that podcast, Eyvonne Sharp and William Collins. Welcome both. Thanks for doing this today.
Super happy to be here. How did you feel coming into Kentucky, by the way? Was it everything you ever dreamed of?
It was great. It's a real airport in Louisville. Not a problem at all. And I just had a little geography problem realizing that Lexington isn't really a suburb of Louisville. But enterprise car rental helped me out.
Well, where I live, anything within an hour and a half is a suburb. So that's the reality. But also, I'm close to my folks' house. So I'm going to go see the horses at my folks' house and visit with them while I'm in town. So double dipping on this trip.
That's awesome. Happy to provide you an opportunity for that. You're already doing that for KY Nug tonight anyway.
It's just an added bonus.
Yeah. Looking forward to the Nug meeting tonight. And we'd love taking advantage of doing things in person like this. And thank you, William, for all the remote gear and all the setup that you don't hear in the background of the podcast here. But today with these hosts, if you don't know them, they have great experience in cloud platforms and cloud networking. And today I want to focus on kind of bridging that gap for ops teams between traditional networking and cloud networking. I start with this basic thesis. Cloud networking isn't going away. Duh, right? We know that it's coming at us, but don't ever believe the hype that when new thing X is here, old thing Y is definitely completely dead, right? Y is traditional networking. That's not going away either. We're going to have both cloud networking and traditional networking for the foreseeable future. And remember, even below the surface on cloud networking, you have real network equipment, real cable.
Really?
I think so.
I thought it was infinitely scalable, my friend.
No. Well, infinite is relative, perhaps, but both are here to stay. And traditional NetOps folks need to learn cloud operations and cloud networking. And cloud networking is just a small piece of it. Every cloud platform brings this suite of services and even eliminates some things I think we'll talk about during the conversation today that could be an actual benefit in what you do. So traditional NetOps folks, you need to be cloud literate. And I would even say for folks who were started in cloud, you ought to learn some traditional networking stuff as well. So that's going to be the tone for the conversation today, and we'll see where that goes. Let me start with this. Off the top of your heads, that's not true. I gave you notes before this. What are the biggest NetOps related differences between cloud networking and traditional networking? And Eyvonne, let's go to you first. What comes to mind?
Yeah, well, I think the tools that you have for troubleshooting and visibility are radically different. In traditional networking, you do have syslogs, which is more like the cloud, but also you have physical devices that you connect to. You have show commands. You have things like that where you connect to a device and figure out what's really going on with it. In cloud networking and cloud in general, observability is incredibly important. And that is understanding what logs, metrics, and alerts you need to capture, and then which of those log metrics and alerts are meaningful, and to surface those in a way that is actionable. I think one of the challenges that we always have had with logging and alerting platforms is if your it's going to show my age, your pager or your BlackBerry buzzes every time an alert happens and you don't have a way to determine whether or not it's meaningful, then you end up ignoring those and black holing them. So I think that one of the biggest challenges is understanding what are my vectors for information, for understanding what's going on in the system. How do I surface the ones that are most meaningful and important and actionable? And I think that is a different approach than what we see in traditional networking. And I would think that's the biggest difference that I see.
So I think the log and alerting issue, you're spot on, but aren't we like even killing ourselves on the traditional side and the cloud side with more and more streaming telemetry and deciding what's relevant and actionable is becoming more of a challenge both on the virtual side and the physical side.
Well, it's a bit art and science, and I think that's where experience comes to play is understanding what's meaningful and valuable, and not to be an over the top AI champion, but there is tooling that's being built into our logging and alerting systems, and I think AI is going to be a unique tool in this space to help us understand over time which alerts are most meaningful. And it takes every environment's different. And so it takes some focused effort to understand what's important. There is no one size fits all which alerts matter in your environment because every environment meets a use case.
William, don't want to leave you out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, but I'm going to try and summarize as best as I can. So, network ops, traditionally, your network operations center, just the day-to-day. So first of all, culture is just gigantic and all of this stuff. It's almost like, if you ever talk to like a fitness guru, maybe you're trying to shed some pounds or something, there's always some statistic where it's like, oh, it's actually this much diet up here, and then there's this other stuff. And that's kind of like this transition. It's hugely, it's like DevOps is not a position. It's not a department. It's not, it's actually a cultural shift. And what does that cultural shift mean specifically for networking is, I remember I worked in a network operations center at one point, and some of my day-to-day was very ticket driven. Okay, like we had a piece of hardware fail in our data center. Of course, we're highly available, but we want to spin up an RMA as soon as humanly possible. We get on, open up a TAC case, maybe talk to an engineer, do show tech, all these things. We grab all this data for whatever. Well, actually, you wouldn't do a show TAC on something that completely failed, but yeah. But just get all the data you possibly can. You populate the case, and then you wait. You take their ticket number, you put it in your ticket system, and you do all this cross-referencing. Maybe you have like an alert board, and there's all these different tasks that you have to do just for like swapping out a piece of hardware. And that's a big part of operations, is getting that process rolling. And then that gets shipped somewhere. And then you have to have hands-on come in, if you're not in that data center, and swap it out during a change window, which you also set up. You set up a change window, and then you have to, configure the device, put the configuration back on. So you have all these things that are kind of like, that's just a standard task that network operators are on the hook for. But when you go to cloud, this change management process and the way that you make changes drastically changes completely. I'm using changes a lot because there's a lot of changes here. So going from like a traditional ITIL driven change management process, you're really going into this thing of pipelines, because there's, in the cloud world, there's a lot more velocity of changes happening. There's tons of changes across
smaller changes typically.
Yeah, small changes, testing against those small changes, deployed quickly in repeatable pipelines, which we set up at one point when we were trying to get, this is in a past life at a past organization, we had a few different processes for greenfield things coming in the cloud that we didn't have to go through the change management board for. Since they were net new, they had nothing existing within them. We could go out and we could run these pipelines even during business hours and create the VPC, the subnet design, and all, some of these core services. So then when such a time that the developers would come and start building, then they had their stuff ready to go. But all that had to do with figuring out how to break those changes into small pieces, really standardizing your infrastructure as code, working and partnering with change management. But at the end of the day, kind of like Eyvonne was saying, it's many different new tools that you're not used to. Instead of on the CLI, you're in version control. you're committing code, you're branching, you're doing a lot of those different things, which is something that a lot of traditional network engineers are either dabbling into now, but they haven't really, like, it wasn't their starting point. So that's kind of my take on it anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The removal of that hardware layer from the user is a big deal. Come to think of it, I have not been a heavy cloud user. I've worked on specific projects, but I've never had to open up a case for a hardware failure. That's completely hidden to me. What happens behind the scenes, Eyvonne? What are we not seeing that's happening in those big data centers in western Loudoun County in Northern Virginia?
Well, I am not an expert on those processes, but there's still people who go out and do physical things, and there are systems that are hopefully a little more seamless than the trauma that William just put us all through. But at the same time, there are still physical hands that go out and swap things, and there are alerting systems, and there is an understanding of the particular environment that's in play and what needs to happen. I think that the thing that happens at scale is more on the engineering side. Use fewer SKUs, very carefully engineered for scale, because and I think I said this in another recent recording, scale breaks things. And so the bigger the scale, the more tight the engineering and the processes have to be for those things to work and to be able to survive failures. I think one of the things that we need to just continue to emphasize: failures happen, and they will happen, and you need to just engineer for those. And I think that's what we've seen at the large scale data centers, that they have done incredibly well. But I also think, when we talk about our existing operational processes, those were built around time windows that assumed a physical person needed to go do a physical thing, and we have shrunk the time windows for execution on the technology side, but our organizational processes are still catching up. And that's where we have to sit back and interrogate those and go, now, does it really take 24 hours for this thing to happen? Or did we build this process assuming it took 24 hours for the person that was going to do the work to get on shift and to find the parts and to show up and swap the thing? Right. That's incredibly hard work.
No doubt. And let me go back to the kind of the personal view of the traditional network operator. What you call trauma, Eyvonne, I think William might call Tuesday. From the old world, traditional networking. But you called out the point that so much of what that NOC engineer does is managing hardware faults and the replacement of gear and all the processes around that an enterprise NOC doesn't need to do anymore. So there might be maybe an impact on identity where so much of what was my job has now been sucked up into the cloud. What would you say to traditional network engineers who feel threatened by a big part of what I do is being taken away? I'll put that to you, William.
So I worked for someone that was ex-Army one time, and I hope he listens. I'm actually going to have him listen to this. He was a great mentor, and he was just no nonsense. And one of his things that he was always insistent on at that time, especially in my career, was, all this stuff could change overnight. You need to learn more about the things that are going on around us. He really pushed me and gave me a lot of very strong feedback. Sure. And that got, what it did for me at the time, it was earlier on in my career, is it got me thinking different. We have these adjacent areas, and yeah, I could live in my own little network bubble, but okay, I should probably learn, if I learn a little bit about databases, it doesn't mean I'm saying goodbye network engineering. It just means I'm learning a little bit about databases, and it helps us on the network support the database team better. or compute or all the other, application teams. And so you always, if you choose the profession of network engineering, especially, or anything in technology, I would say, especially with the advent of AI and like where machine learning and Gen AI is headed, you just got to keep learning. And it's not about getting a certification to slap on someone's table. Like you really need to, like I've gone through a lot of certification tracks,
Right.
and not taken the test just because we had the resources available. And maybe I should have taken the test and got more certs to, throw on LinkedIn. But like for me, my goal was like, I just need to understand this better because I need to, okay, if my team is successful, that means my department is successful. My department's successful. We're starting to get bigger. Like, okay, the organization is going to be successful. Like the network is going to better support the wherever the corporation is headed at that time. So really just getting out and learning and trying new things. Like automation was one big thing for me early on. And that was something I picked up a long, long time ago, like bash scripting first and then Perl and then Python and then Ansible. Like I've gone full circle with that stuff. And I loved every single one of them at the time. Would I go back and use Perl today? Not a chance. But ChatGPT can still translate some of my Perl scripts to Golang, which is pretty interesting.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah. And they work. Yep. So yeah, it's just, continual learning.
Well, I think, Scott, the thing that you're hitting on here is a more deeply personal thing, and that's about identity, right? And we have to do some introspection about that and think about what is the mission of our organization. And operations, your mission is to keep the organization running as smoothly as possible. And so if you reframe the work that you do around what is it that I need to do to keep this organization running smoothly, that has nothing to do with whether or not you physically put your hands on drives or whether you respond to a specific type of alert. And I also like to remind people that we none were born knowing BGP.
The Bridging Gap Protocol.
Border Gateway Protocol. Thank you. And that we have the capacity to learn. And everything we know, we learned. And we can learn the next thing too. It is not a threat to my personhood that I need to learn something new and different. And if we reframe who we are around how we serve the mission of our organization, as opposed to the particular technology du jour at the moment, I think we'll be better workers, but we'll also be happier and we will be better co-workers. And like we might actually make the world a little better instead of being the resident curmudgeon.
I got something here. So, I mean, everything you said was just amazing. I love it. And I'll add one thing is it's a good opportunity, I would say, for the titans of our industry, the Eyvonnes and the Scotts of the world that really have done a lot of great things and have a lot of amazing experience to change the perception from the folks in the industry that do have that experience and do have the clout and the integrity to, pave a better way. Like as far as like community, stuff. So like you have internal stuff specific to your org and then you have external stuff. And we look to folks like you all for, guidance, for motivation, for, what's next. And I think that's one thing that the application, DevOps, and these other spaces have done so well on the community side is they've hit it out of the park. They've made it contagious. And I think we have a little bit of that, but just not to the same levels as some of these other verticals.
I think you both gave incredible counsel on this. And I would, processing what you said, Eyvonne, there's a whole other conversation about maybe there's a problem if you identify too closely with what you do for your paycheck. There's bigger conversation there. We'll fork that for another episode. But I would add on to what you both said. Look at the history of Silicon Valley and tech. It's all about change and disruption. And not just in our time span. You go all the way back to the founding of Texas Instruments, and even back further than that. And it's constant change, some of which is useful technological innovation, some of which not so much. But we're in a career field where you have to deal with it and be ready to do it. And from the selfish profit motive, if you're able to learn new things and do new things, there's opportunity for you too. Now, I recognize that's really easy for me to say because I'm just wired as a lifelong learner, and I loved school. I loved high school. I love university, and my kids roll their eyes at me. They don't understand this at all. So I know not everybody is wired to just keep soaking up new information like a sponge, but there's room for you to do stuff with it if you're able to do that.
Well, I think people often do a risk calculation but it's really hard to perceive the risk associated with the unknown. And I think part of what we have to change in our thinking is that the thing that I've always known how to do is the safe place. That may not be true, right? And if you are able to be on the front end of the new thing, you can help shape it as opposed to allow it to somebody else to come in and shape your world and your experience, right? I mean, you have a choice. One gives you more control.
Sure.
The other doesn't. But often we just have to go, oh, wait, the world is moving. What do I need to do to continue to do meaningful work in the world as it is changing, not as I imagine it should always be, right? And that's more how we think about our work than anything. And it applies across the board.
And that's great if you're somebody who is comfortable being on the leading edge, but you don't even have to be a person who's an early adopter, right? You can be one of those people who wants to sit back and watch. And like, if you haven't invested in any cloud training or cloud certs now in 2024, you still can, and it can still be really helpful for your career.
That's right. I mean, a decade ago, it was like, what's going to come of this cloud thing? There's a lot going on in AWS. It's interesting. Like, I think we're pretty certain now that it's a thing, and it's a long-term thing, and there are important, meaningful workloads running in the cloud.
I'm gonna write that down just to, I remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah. What, the cloud is a thing? Yeah. Wow.
Oh, if you go back, I was the biggest. So if you follow me on any platform, you might come to the conclusion that I like cloud at this point. I am making a career out of cloud-based things. I'm a big advocate for cloud, but I was the biggest. I was one of the folks that said, there's no way that we're not going to put our stuff in someone else's data center. Get out of here. Not going to happen. And that was one of my thoughts and decisions that aged very poorly. It was kind of the opposite. It's like, oh, we're going to try to shift everything to cloud in like 5 months. And it's perception. But one of the things about that is you can have those opinions, but when you're kind of working with all the information you have at the time. Like at that time, there was not a lot of companies using cloud. It was new. And I try to be more thoughtful for new things coming down the pipe now, for sure.
You seem to be doing okay with that. Yeah, just an observation.
Just personal, reflecting outwards. But you can change your perception when new data becomes available. You have the option, and it's never a bad thing to go back and say, hey, I was wrong about that. This is actually a great thing, and here's why. We have more data now, and now I understand X, Y, and Z. You can always change this.
Growth is good. You can write that one down too, Scott.
Growth is good.
I need a t-shirt, please.
That's not the Gordon Gekko quote that I remember. So let's launch off that to maybe another practical area that introduces complexity and opportunity. And that's the availability of the multiple major cloud platforms that don't do anything the same way with each other. That seems like another really impactful thing for traditional network operators who are trying to learn all this cloud stuff that we've established is a thing. You tell me if you think this is valid, but I relate this back to, the router and switch CLI wars, right? iOS from Cisco became dominant. I was an early Juniper person and really had to fight it has to be iOS or iOS like for us to do anything with it. And we were successful, right? And then you had other operating systems come around. So you're all trying to configure BGP, but you got to do it a different way on all these major platforms. I see parallels to that with cloud platforms. Is that crazy? Tell me what you think.
No, I don't think it's crazy. And I think it's even worse, right? Like we are not going to see the kind of interoperability that we saw between networking gear and the clouds. Other than
Heresy noted we're not going to see interoperability.
Well, my point is so for example, a Google Cloud VPC is radically different than an AWS VPC. So Google Cloud VPCs are global in nature. AWS ones aren't. So when you build infrastructure, how you build it is going to should be radically different, or you're going to create an inefficient system. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, right? They're all going to run BGP because it's never going to die,
right? Because
that is our interoperability at the network layer at this point, right? Is BGP. And so, but I think still, we've long in networking talked about fundamentals. There are some key things you still need to know how to subnet. You still need to know basics of routing. You still need to understand the RFC 1918 addresses and how those are different from publicly routable IP addresses. All of those things are important knowledge that you need both in traditional networking and in cloud networking. But I do think most organizations that I see that are successful in cloud identify a primary cloud provider. Doesn't mean that they won't use other clouds, but they typically identify a primary one, which is going to be their go-to, except for things where there's a radical benefit of using another cloud. If you are in an organization that is moving to cloud in an ops role, you should look around and hopefully you've got a leader that's going to make this clear to the team what your primary cloud provider is. And that's where you start, in education, in, reading blogs, in checking out architectural frameworks that have been published by that cloud and getting an associate level certification, right? And start there, but then know that the constructs, even if they're named the same, may function radically different in another cloud. And do not accept the way one cloud provider does things as gospel, because it could be different elsewhere. But all of those things are not really radically different than how we've always done them, and in my perception.
Yeah, there's just so much here. There's so many different ways you can look at this. So kind of what you were saying, just from I remember a long time ago, F5. I was working on F5s. I was doing a big project, and they went through a transition where the shell they were using something called Big Pipe, and they shifted over to something called TMSH. And I was actually writing a bunch of, scripting to interact with the, front end CLI itself. And I remember when that transition happened, the commands changed and there was a lot of changes. But at the end of the day, I still knew, okay, this is the behavior I want on the load balancer. The behavior of the load balancer did not change. There's still persistence profiles. There's still I rules. There's still VIPs pointing to pool members and all this different things.
You're triggering all the F5 people in the audience right now. So
even a few of us who may have worked on NetScalers in our day. Go ahead.
So I remember when that that's sort of the transition that would happen a lot of times. And then Cisco would come out with a new OS. Okay, I know what a VLAN is. I know what a trunk is. I know what bits, frames, packets, yada, yada, yada. Okay, that didn't change, but the way that I configure and dictate the behavior on the network changed. With cloud, you both are spot on with, especially Eyvonne, that's the same thing I see all the time. So you have your primary cloud provider, you sign a EDP or whatever the discount program is for some sort of agreement. And then you have, if you're big enough, maybe you have multiple lines of business. And, the challenge there is you may have a big line of business. It's not a profit center. They're generating revenue and they're saying, hey, I'm going to use this other cloud. If you don't help me, we're plowing right ahead. So it's in your best interest to get in front of that and try to make the world a better place within your organization. But back to the things. So going from that network engineering mindset to the cloud, another thing Eyvonne pointed out, which is spot on, Google, global VPCs, AWS, regional VPCs, even down to the subnet architecture. Some of the clouds are doing some really fancy, layer 2, trickery to say, hey, we can span a single subnet across all availability zones within a given region. But then you have some clouds that are very much into like fault and isolation, where a subnet is only in scope for one availability zone within that cloud. Well, that actually changes. It changes a lot of things. It changes your, like Eyvonne said, it changes your whole architecture and how you approach things and how the application developers and the cloud engineering teams are building things. So one of the things when I really pivoted hard, and it's funny because I said a long time ago, I didn't want to do networking anymore. I wanted to get into cloud because I was tired of the firefighting, and it just, the grass is always greener.
How's it working out for you, William?
I work for a network startup and I love it actually. So, one of the things that's beautiful about the cloud is they sort of like kind of a good and a bad thing where you can kind of paint yourself in the corner, but you don't have as much flexibility. You can't roll into the data center, recable things, or just get on and start changing core routing, add some static routes, do, a janky BGP policy, route map, and just do a whole bunch of trickery like that. In the cloud, it's pretty narrow on what you can and can't do and what resources you can and can't use. And what I did when I still do this all the time, I have to read the cloud provider, which the cloud, like AWS, Azure, GCP, and Oracle is getting there as well. Sorry. But documentation for those big three is just really good. It's some of the best documentation, and it's usually very much up to date just because of how these hyperscalers handle documentation in the first place. So doing a lot of reading and understanding limitations and such. And that's where sort of instead of understanding the commands that drive the stuff, it's almost like, yeah, you need to understand the behavior of the VPC like we talked about. But another thing you have to really look into more than in the traditional world is limitations. Like, okay, a VPC can hold this many of some resource. Well, that's perfect. But then when I go down to that resource, well, that resource can only have this many rules or this many that. Well, that actually changes. Okay, like we're going to run into that. We know we are. So, okay, we actually need another VPC. And we need to sort of like break this out a little bit. So you really have to understand that. And not to say that you have to make all those core decisions immediately, because you can always create a new VPC. You can always create, you can scale out, you can add additional CIDRs, but it really helps you to think about those things up front so you have a good plan going in. You got to know what you're trying to do. Right. And then, map that to the resources that you're going to use.
I don't think most folks would have any heartburn with limitations associated with certain services, whether they're networking services or other. We run into that in physical equipment all the time. Not enough RAM. I ran a project where we upgraded all the RAM in 100 plus routing engines in an operational network, and I don't recommend it. But those are real limitations, right? You just read the fine manual, read the fantastic manual, and figure out what those limitations are that are always documented well. Sometimes they are. Some organizations do a better job at that than others. I want to pick at the interoperability comment a little bit. And on one hand, we've seen interoperability and networking evolve pretty well. When I use a VLAN, I know what a VLAN is on just about every major piece of vendor gear. There's very well-known behaviors that maybe weren't there 25 years ago or 30 years ago, but work pretty well today. And Eyvonne, I would love for you to expand on, that reduced hope of interoperability between cloud provider services, knowing that there's some apples and oranges there. I know it's not a completely fair question because the suite of services on any given cloud platform is much bigger than just networking services. but it seems like an issue.
Well, I don't know that if I don't know that I would call it as much an issue as a reality, and that ultimately every cloud is a uniquely built abstraction that was built with certain engineering principles in mind that grew out of a particular type of organization.
Right.
And if you think of AWS, they had a certain philosophy for how they built their in-house technology that strongly drove how they built AWS. Same is true for Google Cloud, right? Strong engineering focus. It's why you have a Google Cloud, a cloud console that works on every single service, why everything is API driven from the start. And so I believe the genesis of those cloud providers was probably more unique than the genesis that we saw back when networking first came to be.
Sure.
And so those are just some realities. I think that the important thing is to just consider what are the commonalities from a networking perspective. It's IP, V4 and V6, but still predominantly V4, whether we like that reality or not. And to understand those realities. Now, above the and in networking, you can always interconnect your clouds with BGP, and you can share routes back and forth just like you would between on-premises facilities or between cloud providers. Those capabilities are still there and will continue to be there. And then there are different cloud services that may be built on open source solutions, PostgreSQL, for example, right? That's going to operate the same no matter what cloud that you're in. I think the important thing is to understand what you need to accomplish and then map that to the cloud provider services and just not assume, because I learned a thing. I learned how a VNet functions in Azure. That doesn't mean that's the way that a VPC is going to function in AWS or a VPC in Google Cloud. And I think that those assumptions we have to be sure that we're not making.
Other interoperability observations or lack thereof?
Yeah. So, there's a lot there. I think when it comes to any new tech vendor that's kind of hitting, coming out of the valley now, everything, you have to have a good software story. You really have to have a good API story. You have to have some good developers. Like, APIs are really like the ecosystem now, and it's much easier for like I work for Alkira, and that's one of our big things. We do a lot of integrations with a lot of different vendors, for interoperability. But it's much easier for us as a new company to come out and do that. Well, I say new, but 2018. But if you look at the companies that were coming up through the 90s, they have so many different software platforms. There is so much there. There's not a light switch that you're going to flip that's going to put a magical API to control all the different APIs of all this big company and make it immediately easier for a consumer. So that takes time, even for large companies. So one of the things that I think is really hard for an enterprise is, you see this a lot on the security side more so, but like a new product will come out and it's like, you've got to change how you do this thing everywhere. Like, everything's got to change to adopt this new paradigm. And that's really hard for enterprises to just flip a switch and then, change all the things for the sake of like maybe zero trust or something. So I think there's two sides to this interoperability thing. There's how the enterprises consume the technology, but there's vendors. Like, I think as vendors, you've just got to, you have to put yourself in the perspective of the customer and think about, okay, like how is this going to be adopted? Do they have to like flip over the whole table and just knock everything over? Or is there like a nice path for adoption? So, vendors have to do better, but also like on the enterprise side, knowing what you have and understanding your brownfield is a challenge. there's a lot of brownfield, people leave, and it's been like that everywhere probably I've ever worked. It's a challenge.
Yeah. And I just want to like hone in on that a bit, because I'm sitting here while you're talking and thinking about interaction surfaces. Like I hear Russ White in the back of my head talking about interaction surfaces.
Not just me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so some of this is how we organize our applications in our environment, and break it down to understand. And so if really we need to think in terms more of business functions and applications, and then how those entities interact with all the other entities in our org. And that can be whether or not those applications are running on premises or whether they're running in the same cloud or different clouds. And if I would love to someday see an organization that really understands the dependency map of all their services. That is getting incredibly complex. And so, it's where do we do authentication? Who provides our security services?
Right.
Which of these things, if they fail, are going to cause everyone to have a bad day? Identity is an easy one to pick on, right? Because you really need a central identity provider. And so that can be a challenge. But I think it's better to think in terms of applications, services, and functions, and then understand what's underneath those, instead of just like, oh, well, this is our Google Cloud environment, or this is our on-premises environment. Let's start thinking about those from an application perspective and functions that they provide the end user, and then how all that unpacks.
My head's gigantic. I mean, to that point, I've heard some stories, and I lived through one of these scenarios as well, where you have this kind of okay, we build it, they will come, and going, I was part of a sort of a process that was to say, hey, we have these, I think it was 5 or 6 application patterns. Everything's going to be microservices, and we're just going to start putting things on the assembly line, and they're going to come out the other end as a perfectly well architected Google-like application with Google-like scale. And it's not that easy, because, okay, to your developers, if they even ever use Kubernetes, do they understand containers? Do they understand how to architect an application for a distributed, a really distributed application that would merit using Kubernetes in the first place? There's so many different things there, because, hey, if all you need is like a scalable cloud storage, a managed cloud, like a PaaS service for storage that handles the, replication cross region, and then you have highly resilient like load balancers and VMs for a specific application that does a thing for a region or something smaller. Yeah, you don't probably need Kubernetes for that. Probably not, but yeah.
Well, you brought up the K word, and let me try to. Well, we'll close on the interoperability discussion. Not close, but pause. Right, more we could say. I think, different era for different technological developments. The internet, grew up as this huge worldwide underlay, and the need to drive standards for that very specific set of functions, networking, lent itself to, everything of the IETF and IEEE for certain pieces of the puzzle have brought to the table. And it's actually kind of amazing that it all works the way it does from a network plumbing perspective. I think if you look at the emergence of any of the cloud providers, and I'm sorry if I misquote what you said, they all grew up in different specific circumstances. And Google had a suite of IT services that it started with and has expanded with. So has AWS, so is Oracle, so has Azure, and other emerging ones. And that's a different ball of wax, a whole suite of IT services versus just the network plumbing. No disrespect to all our good friends in the network engineering and operations field. That's kind of how I rationalize it all. However, do either of you see the day where there is increased workload mobility across cloud platforms that will enable better competition and maybe even drop prices down. Maybe we should call Corey Quinn up right now. What's the future of that look like, Eyvonne? Surprise question. I know we didn't prep for this.
Well, I think that there are. Here's the thing: when you get that, you're getting the lowest common denominator service of every provider, right? Because it has to be, if it has to run on all of them and also on-prem, that's a lowest common denominator kind of a situation. And maybe there are going to be some applications where that makes sense. But I do think to really gain advantages of running in cloud, and having, the level of resiliency that we need from our applications, it's actually going to make more sense to use the resiliency capabilities that exist inside of a cloud than it is to try and make an application resilient across clouds. That's what I've seen. I don't know that I have seen a large to-scale application that actually runs in production in different clouds. I just don't think it's the right model if what we want is resiliency. And there are other ways to manage cost beyond just, hey, I'm going to pick up all my workloads and move them, because that in and of itself is an expensive endeavor. So I'm pretty bearish on that capability.
That's fair.
I feel like I'm going to keep saying this, but there's a lot there.
It's because there is.
So kind of Eyvonne's answer kind of has me going down a different rabbit hole. So if you are going to build a application in the cloud, there is no good reason for you to not build that application with high availability and disaster recovery within that same cloud provider.
Preach.
Yeah. But when you do that, you have to understand that, say that it's a really highly scalable application and you're hosting, you're not doing this active standby stuff. You're actively hosting out of multiple regions. Well, you can just keep like doubling and tripling your cost because you have a lot of increased infrastructure. So the cost component to that is pretty big. Now, I have seen and I have talked to some big companies that have made their workloads portable and have used that as a negotiation mechanism with cloud. So they have the ability, if they wanted to pull the strings on an application, they could move it. But a lot of the work there actually is on the application side.
Sure.
So the infrastructure is a less tricky problem than designing the application to work. Because if you think about it, in cloud, it's never just one service. Like you may have storage that you own. You may have storage back on premises. You may have platform as a service storage. Well, how does the platform as a service storage work from one cloud to the other? Okay, like we're talking, earlier we were talking subnets. Okay, well, are you synchronous within the same region for that type of storage? And of course, asynchronous region to region. How does it handle the synchronization? What does operations look like? And you do that for each individual component of all the things. So doing that, like saying, I think doing it where you're saying, yeah, I'm hosting this application out of AWS and Azure, or Azure and GCP at the same time. In theory and in practice, I think that's really not it's not the way. But there is, a lot of, companies that do have the ability to do that if they need to.
Well, and I think the question then leaders need to make is, where do we want to put our developer resources? Do we want to invest in making it so that this application can move from place to place to place? Or do we want to leverage the capabilities of our cloud provider, the resilience that they provide, and use the skills of our developers to build a competitive advantage into our solutions?
Sure.
And that is the calculus that leaders have to make. And I think I would argue that they're going to get further in their business if they put the talent of their developers into their operations people into understanding how to leverage the capabilities that the cloud provider experts have already built.
I feel like these are good answers for the state of the art today, right? They're all very sensible responses. I'm going to be a little bit of the contrarian and say, well, we'll see what the market drives. The market's a really powerful force. And if companies can control costs with the resiliency mechanisms within a given cloud, maybe that's the way to manage it. And I'm only, just kidding a little about calling Corey. I would love to have a follow-up conversation with him on that. I think that we might see more pressure to do that differently or think more broadly, because I can think of the same conversation with the router vendors and who are really good BGP implementers, right? And 20 years ago, there were 2 router vendors that had rock solid BGP implementations, and that is not the case anymore. And again, the apples and oranges. I don't mean to compare a fairly complex routing protocol and set of capabilities with a whole IT delivery environment. But we saw that get better over time, where I can mix and match the routers in my network doing, inter-AS peering, for example.
Well, I mean, from the actual just purely network perspective, I mean, my company does this today. So our platform can be put on any of the cloud providers. So we have customers that'll say, hey, we're going to deploy, in East region, we have, 2 pockets for all of our resources to connect to. One of them's in this cloud, one of them's in that cloud. And they have that resiliency, plus they're using the high availability of a given cloud provider on their side. But one of the things that I don't think from the application, the engineering, the soft cost and the hard costs, this is just very expensive.
Sure.
So in my experience in enterprise, if you can get the same result while trimming down millions and millions and millions of dollars, 9 times out of 10, you're going to take it.
Sure.
Just because of the cost.
No, I want to add complexity just for the fun of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I do not. I deny that statement. Well, as we wind this down, this has been a great conversation, and there'll be more of these for sure. Let's exit on what hope would you give traditional networking people listening in on skilling up on cloud, learning more about cloud? What hope would you give them? What resources would you recommend them to? One or 2 nuggets before we close.
Yeah, I think, we often talk about T-shaped skills, right? We're deep in one area and broad in others. I think that there is a ton that traditional network engineers already know that is still going to be transferable. And so they already know part of it. It is more difficult to teach a pure software developer who has never had any networking experience, cloud infrastructure and VPC design and all of those things, than it is to teach it to a traditional network engineer, because they already have sort of a mental model that's closer. So there's that. And then what I would also recommend is, take some training, find some podcasts. There's the great podcast that we represent here. There's also our friends over at Cables to Cloud that talk about these topics. And then, Google Cloud offers some Coursera training that's cheap and available to spin up lab environments and start playing around with it. All the cloud providers offer free trials that folks can spin up. I think the best way is to just start to pick a cloud and start experimenting. And I think what people will find is that it's not as novel as maybe they originally thought it might be.
So to your point about things translating, this is it. So you're connecting to the cloud. How in the world do you connect to the cloud? Well, you got to use the network to connect to the cloud. Yep. You have to do a VPN or you have to do a direct connect. And then, okay, a direct connect, you have like a layer 2. It's, essentially like a layer 2 circuit. Okay, well, you've got to route over that. So you need BGP to do that. Well, if you're highly available, okay, like in say you're in a colo and you have your own gear. Well, there's hardware involved, there's optics involved, single mode, multi-mode, all the things we're used to. Plus, I would say in that world, like routing actually gets more complicated because you've come out of the four walls of your data center and you just got stuff everywhere. And you really need a way to control and understand your traffic patterns if you're going to support your network. So network engineering is going to remain, to me, it's like plumbing. It may not seem like the coolest thing ever. In fact, if you talk to, some of the college kids out there, it's the last thing they want to touch, but it is core, it's critical. And, it's definitely coming into cloud because you're not getting rid of TCP IP and BGP anytime soon or ever. So, and to Eyvonne's point, like each one of these clouds, the beautiful thing when I was studying for my CCIE a long time ago, which I actually just got rid of a lot of the old gear that I had and freed up a lot of space. It's the amount of dust was insane. I had to go and buy this stuff actually had to have my mom purchase this stuff on eBay at the time, and you've got to cable it all. You've got to figure it out. You're going through books. Now it's so much easier. Each cloud has a free tier. It's so quick to spin things up. There's no reason not to. For the time investment, you get a lot of value from the time that you're committing, and it's free. You don't have to pay for anything unless you're doing some crazy stuff. There's a lot of free tier services. So go out and experiment. Figure it out. And for me, like hands-on and practice, that's the way like I learn. I can read a book and I can watch a video, but I really need to get in and do a thing. So that's, I guess
you can absolutely like get you a little MikroTik router or spin you up a router on Linux, and you can absolutely build a tunnel between your home gear and cloud, and you can play around with all of that interoperability. You can play around with route distribution, how that works, and you can do that much easier to William's point than we did 15 years ago with a rack of gear that sucked a bunch of power and irritated our spouses.
I'm sure marriages have ended based on home lapse.
Oh, there was the Mommy, who's that man coming up out of the basement? That's your father. He's just been spending too much time with his networking equipment. So this is a great way to wrap this. There's great information if you're motivated to go and read or even try. It is up to you. Nobody's going to do this for you. But think about the information environment that has emerged around us and that both of you have actually contributed to, right? There's nothing stopping you from going and acquiring skills on one cloud platform. You don't have to do everything. Just start somewhere. So, great encouragement for the traditional network engineers on the other end of the podcast. Where can folks reach you to?
Yeah, find me on Twitter at Sharp Network or on LinkedIn at Eyvonne Sharp. Blog is esharp.net.
William-Collins on LinkedIn, and the Twitters or X's, whatever you prefer, WCollins502. And then Eyvonne and I also host the Cloud Gambit podcast, so check it out. We talk about a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things of the adjacent areas of networking as well.
Highly, highly recommended. I enjoy the Cloud Gambit. And I enjoy both of you too. Thanks very much for doing this today. And thank all of you for tuning in to another hour wasted on Total Network Operations. No, just kidding. We know your time's valuable. Thanks for listening in. If you've heard previous episodes, this is an ongoing project. I'm using these conversations to figure out what's going on in the network operations environment today to try to distill this down into useful information. In 2025, you'll see more formal things coming out, maybe in terms of a field guide or other useful info. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's the best way to go. And if you have specific follow-up, you can send that to packetpushers.net/follow-up. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on Teen Ops.